Hello, everybody. This is Debbie Powell, Master Gardener Coordinator for Calaveras and Tuolumne counties. And Al Dahlstrand is going to give a presentation on water conservation, the need for smart management. Al is a Tuolumne Master Gardener. He's a retired mining engineer. He put in the rainwater harvest system at the garden, and he's just got a wealth of experience. And we're so glad he's here. So Al, take it away.
Okay, we'll talk about a number of things during this session. We're going to start with a historical water overview and some comments about what's been happening with sea level rises and what's been happening in our climate in western U.S. for the last couple thousand years, and more recently into the droughts that we've been experiencing. We'll cover another subject we'll cover would be irrigation systems, drip systems versus overhead watering and irrigation scheduling. Another subject that we'll cover would be lawn replacement with drought-tolerant plants. And this is a very important subject for water conservation. And we won't cover in detail gray water use, but we'll mention it in passing as a potential for water conservation at the home. We'll mention use of mulch while we're talking about lawn replacement. And we'll talk a little bit about permeable landscapes and grading and contouring. And that subject will be covered under lawn replacement as well. And then the end of this first session will cover rainwater collection as well. So there will be a variety of things that we'll discuss. Next slide, Dave. Okay, looking at a historical aspects of how we got here in the position we're in with rising sea levels and so forth. We've been going through a warming period for coming out of the last ice age for the last 15 to 18,000 years. So the Earth has gone through a number of warm and cold cycles, but primarily it's the overall trend has been a warming cycle for the last, say, 15 to 18,000 years. And this first slide is an example of what the world in the area of the United Kingdom of England looked like about 8,500 years ago. And the source of this was the National Geographic December 2012 magazine, talking about how low sea levels were 8,500 years ago. And what this slide shows is it shows right in the center of the slide, it shows England, and it shows Ireland to the left. And it shows an ice sheet over the north part of England and Scotland. And in the upper right of the slide, it shows an ice sheet over Norway. So during this period of time, 8,500 years ago, the ice sheet was coming off of England and Northern Europe, but it was still in existence in the Scandinavian countries and in Russia. And during this period of time, there was also still a substantial ice sheet in North America as well. But this particular slide shows that to the right of England, where today's North Sea exists, it shows land much lower than England. It's like a big, broad valley. And what National Geographic found before they printed this article is that fishermen in the North Sea, by the time they dragged the bottom of the North Sea looking for fish species, they kept on bringing up implements of human use, and they were farm implements. And this happened again and again, and it indicated that during this period of time, when there was no ice sheet over England anymore, that the North Sea never existed at that point in time until further melting of all these ice sheets actually took place. So we see the whole area between the United Kingdom and Denmark is lower land surface that was being farmed at that time. So what this tells us is that sea levels at that point in time, 8,500 years ago, were probably 200 to 300 feet lower than they are now. And the ice sheets still existed over the Scandinavian countries and way north Europe and Russia and also North America. But so this is a fascinating slide of how dramatic the rise or the lower sea levels existed when the ice sheets were still substantially covering the north part of the Earth. So next slide, Debbie. Next slide. Okay. Now this slide covers the area of the state of Washington in the upper central and the left, Idaho in the right side of the slide, and Oregon in the lower left side of the slide. And the purpose of this slide, which came from a book called Glacial Lake Missoula and its humongous floods. This shows the areas of the Columbia River drainage that were dammed up during the ice caps in this area of the United States, and the ice actually dammed up the Columbia River drainage as melting started to begin about 13 to 15,000 years ago. And you can see on the right-hand side of the slide in Idaho and off into Montana, you can see a notation saying Glacial Lake Missoula. And then on the left part of the slide, Glacial Lake Columbia. And then in going down the Columbia River drainage to Lake Lewis, Lake Condon, and then on the lower left, flooded Willamette Valley. Well, what happened, as this book describes, is that during this period of time, 13 to 15,000 years ago, as melting of the ice sheet was starting to happen, there was an ice dam in northern Idaho up near Pend Oreille and Sandpoint, Idaho. And as the ice sheet continued to melt, it dammed up the Columbia River to the east of it. And then it got to the point where the pressure from the water and the continual melting of the ice dam caused the dam to break. And when it broke, there was a humongous flood that roared down into eastern Washington and down the Columbia River drainage all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And the flood and the amount of water was so dramatic that the research that went into the book indicates that this amount of water probably raised sea levels anywhere from 2 to 9 feet with one event. And the book also explains that the ice dam formed again during this period of time with some brief cooling periods that allowed the ice sheets to freeze again and start damming the river drainage up again. So this actually happened 2 or 3 times, probably over tens of thousands of years. And the amount of water that came down the Columbia River drainage was so dramatic that it overflowed the banks of the Columbia River in the Lake Lewis and Lake Condon area. And it couldn't all pass through the river canyon below Portland going out to the coast at Astoria. And a lot of the water backed all the way up the Willamette Valley, all the way up to the Eugene area and flooded that because the water couldn't get out to sea fast enough. So this is just an example of an event or several events coming out of the last ice age that were so dramatic, and they started causing humongous sea level rise from the previous slide that we saw a little while ago. Excuse me. Next slide, David. This is another example of a similar event, and it's called Lake Agassiz, and this happened in the same time period, probably in the 13 to 15,000 years ago. And this covers the north central United States from, say, Minnesota and the Dakotas, all the way up into eastern Saskatchewan and Manitoba. You can see the Great Lakes in the lower right-hand side of the slide. You can see the Hudson Bay in the upper right-hand side of the slide. And the same thing that happened in the Columbia River drainage in the previous slide also happened in this central Canadian area. And this Lake Agassiz, which was formed by ice dams as well, the ice dams broke during the warming periods, and it allowed humongous quantities of water to rush out to sea and cause dramatic sea level rise. And according to the article on these events, that this happened multiple times as well. The first break, I think, was up, the exit of the water was up into the northwest, towards the Yukon and Alaska and out to sea in that direction. And then a further break of dammed up water happened subsequent to that original event, and then went out through the Great Lakes area and out to the east to the Atlantic Ocean. So these kinds of events caused dramatic rises in sea level. And so even though these were 13 to 15,000 years ago, and this caused a lot of sea level rise, the sea level still wasn't high enough to cover the North Sea area that we saw in the first slide, showing the dry North Sea area to the east of the United Kingdom. Let's go to the next slide, David. We're going to talk for a few minutes about weather changes in the past 2,000 years, which is a little bit more familiar to us as far as history is concerned. There was a series of events that were explained in this book called Unstoppable Global Warming. It was written in 2007, references on the bottom of the slide. And it indicated that there was a warming period from about 2000 BC to about 500 AD during the time of the Roman Empire. And then that warming period was followed by a cooler period during the Dark Ages. And the cooling period was roughly about 500 AD to about 900 AD. And after 900 AD, we went into another medieval warming period, about 900 to 1350. And then from 1350 to about 1850, it cooled off again. So you can see there was a series of warming and cooling periods, and it's been warming, overall been warming since the mid-1800s. So you can see what kind of dramatic changes we've had just in the last 2,000 years. Just incredible how much change there's been. Let's go to the next slide. And now there are also some recent droughts, major droughts in the western US that have been documented during this 2,000-year period. And the biggest ones, the first drought was continued for about 100 years, and it started in about 900 AD, and the overall drought lasted about 100 years. And this doesn't mean that every year was a drought year, but it indicates that the overall trend for that 100-year period was more drought years than wet years. And then it cooled off again for a couple of hundred years, and then about 1200 AD, another major drought started, and it lasted for 140 years. And these droughts were identified from tree ring data that was collected in Mono County, Pyramid Lake, and Tenaya Lake, and Fallen Leaf Lakes. And there was another article I read that there were several researchers that actually dove down in Fallen Leaf Lake up near Lake Tahoe, up in the mountains, and they actually went in and took underwater borings through some of the old timber that was there, more than 1,000 years ago, and the timber still was standing underwater. And by taking these cores, they were able to count all the tree rings and determine that these two droughts back in the medieval period indeed happened, and that there was so much warmth that the tree rings were so narrow that there was very little growth on the vegetation. Let's go to the next slide, David. If we look at more recent trends, coming up to when we got into some serious droughts during the 1970s, that pretty much woke everybody up out here in California to how serious these future droughts could be. I looked at the rainfall records in the Sonora area for the 10-year periods of the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. And these rainfall records indicate, even though in the 70s there were 3 drought years, the overall rainfall for the average rainfall per year for the 70s was about what the 100-year average is for the Sonora area, about 31, 32 inches. We see the same thing in the 1980s. The overall rainfall for that decade was about 31 inches, and that included 4 drought years. And the average for the decade of the 90s was 33 inches with 3 drought years. But when we got to the 2000s, for the first decade of the 2000s, it dropped down to about 26 inches, which is 5 inches below the 10-year average, 5 to 6 years below the 10-year average. So over that decade, we saw a substantial drop in rainfall. And I think over that same decade, we've seen a substantial drop in snowfall. Now, I've looked into the snowfall records just in a very cursory way and haven't gone into a lot of detail of what the records show, but they indicate that the amount of snowpack has dropped off, but that doesn't tell the whole story, because the snowfall records really show the amount of water in the snow as well, and the density of the snowpack. Let's go to the next slide, Dave. Now, some recent statistics over the last 10 years provided by public agencies in California indicate that about 50% of residential water is used outdoors in vegetation, in pools, washing cars, and it's a surprising statistic. And they also say that overwatering and careless habits waste about 50% of landscape water. And I can attest to some of that in my earlier years, when we did a lot of rinsing off of driveways and walks and all sorts of things. We didn't think about how we were using water. And about 50%, they feel about 50% of future water needs in California must come from conservation of existing resources in order to meet the future demands. There aren't going to be many big dams built in the western U.S. in the near future. If there are any dams built for water storage, they'll probably be off main river canyons. They'll probably be built in areas like the Coast Range on the west side of the Central Valley, similar to the dam that's up in the Pacheco Pass area, that's used right now for storing water temporarily before it's sent to LA. So this indicates that water conservation is indeed a really, really important thing. 50% of our future needs have to come from conservation of existing resources. Let's go to the next slide. We'll talk about private well sources as a different subject in a presentation later on today, but wells are just as stressed as the snowpack and the lack of storage space for water. And foothill private well capacity is generally very small and unreliable. And after multiple years of drought, we've had a lot of well failures up in Tuolumne County and Calaveras County area, and other foothill counties as well in recent years. And well resources in the foothills and the Central Valley require careful management because we're seeing a lot of well failures in the valley as pumping of groundwater resources increases dramatically during periods of drought. But we'll talk about that as a separate subject in management of wells. Let's go to the next slide. Man's impacts also dramatically caused a lot of wasteful use, and man's impacts to global warming, to increased CO2 production, carbon dioxide production, causing temperature increases and not only the atmosphere, but temperature increases in the ocean, changes in ocean chemistry. So that has a big impact on where our future water needs to come from and how we're doing as far as water resources. And we've seen a lot of loss of equatorial forests that typically consumes CO2 at a fairly high rate. But in waste of water resources, man's also wasting a lot of water and has been doing that for some years. We'll talk more about that. Let's go to the next slide. What can we do about our water shortage problem? Well, individually, we can use water wisely in the home, in our landscape, and we have to do very careful planning and use by public agencies. So we need to be aware of what we do at home, as well as be aware of what's going on politically in our communities, in our state, in our country, and all around the world. Let's go to the next slide. Now we'll just cover a little bit on water conservation practices and water management in the home. Here's a list that we've probably seen in the newspaper a number of times. Using water-saving appliances and toilets, sweeping driveways and walks, not washing them, filling washers and dishwashers before use, get the most clean out of each load that we can. And my wife and I oftentimes in the summertime put a bucket in the shower while the water is warming up, because it usually runs for a minute or two before the water is warm enough to take a shower, and surprising how much water we can catch in the bucket, and then it goes on a deserving plant somewhere outside. Use of a water saving shower head with a shutoff is another water saving item that we all need to look at. A lot of water saving shower heads have a much smaller and much less water, gallons per minute rate coming out of the head itself. Doing simple things like turning off the water for toothbrushing and hand washing is another another technique that can really save a lot of water. Covering your pool and spa when it's not being used. This is a big one. This cuts a lot of evaporation of water. And when we look at our foothill area, typically we have, during a normal summer, in the heat of the summer, we can lose as much as 5 feet of water, 60 inches of water. And in the middle of the summer, the level of your pool water can easily go down half an inch a day or more in the heat of the summer in June, July, and August. So covering the pools is really a big item. Checking for leaky plumbing and appliances and fixing those is another really important item. And in talking with the past Tuolumne Utility District officers, I find that leaky plumbing and appliances, they feel, is one of the biggest water wastes in the community. And then minimize car washing. I know myself, I think I only wash my truck about twice a year, and that's why it always looks so terrible. But car washing, especially people that really prize their car and their paint jobs and everything, that can waste a lot of water when it doesn't need to be done. Next slide. Landscape water management. That's another thing that we have control of in our individual yards. Using drip system type distribution to the plants and timer systems in place of instead of overhead sprinkling is a big saver in water. Basically what you're doing is the drip systems are taking the water right to the plant, and you're not watering areas around the plant and wasting that water. Reducing lawn size or replacing lawns with drought-tolerant plants and hardscapes is another big water saver, and we'll cover this in a more detail in a later presentation. Increasing the use of native and drought-tolerant plants. Water deeply and less often when possible. This will cause the root system to go deeper into the soil, and where the water will not evaporate out of the surface of the soil quite so much. Mulching all plants when possible is another big water saver. And not only is a water saver, but mulching the plants also helps protect the plants from the colder weather too. Recontouring yards for rainwater infiltration by creating swales and low points is another technique that can be used for slowing the rain runoff down so it has more time to soak back into the ground rather than just running off the slope out of your yard and down to the ditch and into the storm drain system. Using pervious materials for walks and patios and driveways like gravel and pavers and these sort of things can cause a lot of the rainwater to soak into the ground and replenish the groundwater and replenish the water for the tree root systems that really need it. Consider the use of gray water when feasible. Although I don't use gray water myself because our home is an older one, and it's kind of hard to take some of the older yards and homes and convert them to gray water use. Gray water is allowed in Tuolumne County, but it has to be very carefully designed, and it has to be very carefully conveyed to specific plants that can take that type of water. This would be, the gray water would typically come from your washing machine and maybe water from showers and sinks. Not the kitchen, however, where you're liable to get a lot of greases and so forth. But there are regulations for it, and for newer homes, it's certainly a consideration. Another thing that that also puts a little bit of rainwater back into our landscape systems is rainwater collection. And the latter half of this presentation will cover rainwater collection fairly extensively. Next slide. In fact, here we go into rainwater collection right away. This slide is 3 collection tanks that my wife and I installed back in 1989 to start collecting rainwater off of part of our roof of our house. And this tank shows an inflow pipe coming from the upper right into the first tank, and then the 3 tanks are connected to each other. These tanks hold about 360 gallons of water each. Next slide. And this is the collection downspout from the roof over our garage, and that part of the house goes into a coffee can and a flexible 90 and into a pipe along the house. Next slide. And this is the pipe going around the corner. Next slide. And this is the pipe coming around the other corner and going into the first tank. These particular tanks are open top tanks, and I typically have them covered over with either plastic covers or plywood covers, so that small mammals and lizards and that sort of thing can't drown in the tanks. But this shows the inflow pipe coming in through a debris basket that can be made out of coat hanger wire and an old screen, and it just allows the water to go through, and the leaves and junk that come off the roof go into the debris basket and can be emptied out on a regular basis. Next slide. And this shows also the first tank in the foreground shows an overflow pipe coming down vertically. And so when these tanks fill up, they overflow and flow out of the garden area, so they don't become a real hazard and a mud bog by the tanks. Next slide. And this is another view showing the connection of the tanks. The center tank and the right-hand tank are connected on the bottom, and the other two are connected on the top. So the two tanks fill at once, and then they overflow into the third tank. They're also in a position where we can dip into the tanks with watering cans and hand water the vegetable garden in the spring and early summer, as long as the water lasts. Next slide. This is a view off the patio showing showing the lids on top of the tanks. So the position of these aren't a real eyesore from the patio, but not every location has the luxury of being able to tuck them away like that. Next slide. This is a downspout and a collection system on the other end of the house. Next slide. And at first, when we first installed these, those went to a 120-gallon tank that was very small, that we tucked in a little enclosure so it wasn't so obvious, and tucked it back underneath a toyon on the opposite side of the house. Since then, we've replaced this tank with a 550-gallon tank in the same location, and it's not that noticeable with the vegetation around it, but the 120-gallon tank went to use down at another outbuilding in the other part of the property. Next slide. And this is one of the original tanks in our garden that was later moved down to an outbuilding and shop and storage area. And it shows the rain gutter discharging into a sloping drain. And that sloping drain goes into a sawed-off 5-gallon bucket, which is a debris bucket, collects debris so the debris doesn't go into the tanks. And then you can see the overflow pipe coming from the tank as well. Next slide. This is a debris bucket that can be made out of a 5-gallon bucket for about probably $5 or $6 worth of parts. And what it consists of is a couple of pieces of wood on the bottom and a couple of fittings, a male and female 1.5-inch PVC fitting. One fits on the outside of the bucket, one fits on the inside of the bucket. They just screw together, and then you can glue in a piece of 1.5-inch pipe on the inside fitting and drill a bunch of holes in it. So when the water goes into the bucket from the drain, it starts filling up, and the debris goes into the bottom of the bucket, and the water doesn't go into the tank until it gets 4 or 5 inches off the bottom of the bucket. So it's a good cheap way to keep a lot of junk out of the bottom of your tank. A lot of leaves and debris from the roof. Next slide. This is a photo of 3 newer tanks that we purchased. These 3 tanks hold about 560 gallons each, and they're tied together on the tops. One overflows into the other. The same drain system comes off of the house that originally supplied the original tanks in the upper part of our vegetable garden that you can see right behind the tanks. And we picked up these tanks at a factory down in French Camp. At the same time, we picked up 2 tanks from the same facility for the Casina demonstration garden. And we'll show those tanks in a few minutes as well. But these tanks and the 2 Casina tanks we picked up very cheaply for about, I think they were about $300 for 5 tanks, because they were off the product line and not for sale anymore at the commercial distribution of the factory that makes these tanks. So we were very, very lucky to find it. Next slide. This is our newest addition to our tanks. We now have 7 tanks total. This is the largest one, and this is a 1,550 gallon tank. And we fill this tank. It fills from the little roof behind it that covers our wood pile, firewood pile. But there's a little brown pipe that comes in from the right-hand side, and that pipe brings a lot of water into the large tank from our pool cover, our winter pool cover. When we've got a small pool that we cover with black plastic, a black plastic sheet during the winter time, and as the rainwater fills up on that plastic to say over 2 or 3 inches, we siphon it off the top, and then that goes into this large tank. And it's amazing how much water you siphon off the top of a pool cover when you consider that you might have 30 inches of rain on a normal average year. Most of that would get siphoned off and just go down the hill into the forest, which is also good for the trees. But we thought, let's try and catch some of it. So at least the first 1,500 gallons or so goes into this tank, and we can save that. Next slide. This is when we use the water out of these tanks. All of our tanks are in such a position that we can't feed by gravity to any of our garden areas. So unfortunately, we have to pump it all with a small submersible pump and a normal garden hose. And that doesn't really bother us, other than the extra time it takes to move the hose. If you've got it on your lawn, a lawn sprinkler, you have to move it a lot. But we also worked out an area where we can pump from any of our tanks into the back end of any one of our 3 major drip systems. And this shows the connection going into the back of the main drip system. The fitting on the right is just the fitting that you screw onto the end of the garden hose. And then we have a Y filter with a 10 micron filter inside to filter out any of the algae and small debris that's in the middle of it. The hose connection also has a coarse screen in it. And so it's the larger stuff, any debris that happened to get into the tanks is taken out by that screen. The finer stuff all comes out with the Y filter. And then when we're not using it, we have a valve here to shut it off. Next slide. This is a building just above the Casino demonstration garden. And before we installed the 2 bigger tanks that we've got. Next slide. The 2 bigger tanks we got were a 1,250 gallon and a 1,350 gallon tank. And this is a foundation that the school wood class actually built forms for. And then the school had a volunteer come in and actually pour the forms for us as a base for the tanks. Next slide. Here are the tanks on the foundation after we filled the back of the foundation with gravel. And the poles around were the installation of the poles to form a fence around the tanks. The wood class was in this building at the time, so these kids had a shop class in there. Since oftentimes the kids were using portable drills, we decided to put a fence around it and lock it so we didn't end up with mysterious holes in the tanks periodically. Next slide. And this is the installation of the piping coming down from the rain gutters. You can see the one to the right of the green ladder coming down vertically, and then one coming angling across the end of the building. Next slide. And then this is the final hookup of the rain gutter collection system through a debris bucket like we saw a few slides back. And then that feeds the first tank. This first tank also has an overflow. When both tanks fill up simultaneously, then this pipe takes the overflow. Next slide. This shows the piping between the tanks, and it's valved coming out of each tank. And then we have a valve on the left that we can open up to distribute water down to the garden itself. And this way we can still use, if we have a problem and need to do some maintenance on one tank, take it out of service for any reason, we can isolate it from the other tank and still take water out of the system. Next slide. And this is shows the final, another view of the final hookup of tanks. These tanks, since they're tied together at the bottom, will fill simultaneously. Next slide. And this shows the final installation with the fence around. Next slide. And this as well, just another view of the final installation. There's about 11-foot difference between those tanks and the level of the garden. So just by gravity out of these tanks, it gives us about 4.5 gallons a minute flow to the opposite end of the garden through garden hose, and which is a little over 4 pounds pressure. So it doesn't supply water real fast, but when you're watering fruit trees or watering major shrubs, you can let it run for a few minutes, and it's an easy way to supplement water after a dry winter or before a real hot summer to a lot of the plants in the garden. Typically, rainwater collection like this doesn't last very long because with the winters we typically have, as well as this winter where we have a couple of dry months, you tend to use a lot of the rainwater during the winter time and early spring. And sometimes by the time May rolls around or early June, you're out of water. But it does give you a chance to keep your plants plenty healthy before getting into the heat of the summer. Next slide. Here's another alternate rainwater collection for somebody that doesn't have either the budget or the space for a larger tank. This goes into a cherry barrel that I obtained out at Hearst Ranch, and you can put a small system into your downspout to divert the water through a pipe into the cherry barrel, and then I added an overflow pipe that goes into an empty garbage can if you have one of those. So by the time you have 45 gallons in the rain barrel and another 30 gallons, there's 75 gallons you've got to distribute to your plants. Particularly good if you have a small garden and not a lot of areas to irrigate. Next slide. And this just shows a closer setup of tying into the downspout and into the barrel itself. Next slide. These are some other options. This is some of the 2x4 water troughs that they use for stocking a lot of times, but you can also use this for rainwater collection as need may be. But these tanks are typically about $100 a piece, so they're not within everybody's budget. Next slide. And if you're really on a tight budget, this is the ultimate cheap water collection device. Just some 5-gallon buckets sitting under the drip line of a building. So it's if you've got happen to have a lot of used buckets around, you can make use of them. And I think that's the last slide, Debbie. No, we're gonna go into, we have a few more. Thinking about irrigation again, we'll get into irrigation a little bit more detail in the next segment, but we need to rethink and revise the type of home irrigation systems that we use. This basically gets us into automated drip systems rather than overhead watering. Next slide. Another thing we'll cover in a little bit more detail in another presentation shortly is lawn replacement. Reducing the amount and the size of the lawns can save a tremendous amount of water. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Next slide. And this is replacing lawns with drought-tolerant plants and a lot of natives. We'll talk about this in more detail. Next slide. And we have to remember too, the available water is really limited, and there's really intense competition for available water between agricultural use, urban use, and environmental uses. And all of these uses have a place, but smart management of how you use the water is the key to saving water and to letting us get through drought periods with much less pressure. There's a lot of intense pressure existing to install twin water diversion tunnels. During the Brown administration, there's the twin tunnels now, and potentially more water to Southern California. The twin tunnel project has kind of dropped back out of the picture a little bit, and but they're still talking about one single large tunnel as a potential. But when we take water out of the delta and cause potential problems for environmental and even agricultural problems, all that has to be very well studied and thought out. So stay up with what's going on in the community and what's going on in your state, because the political pressures are there, and we need to design these wisely and think wisely before we actually jump into them. Next slide.
And it looks like that's the end.
That's the end of that one.
So Al, this is great. This is a great presentation, valuable information, and I know there's more information to go. So I want to thank you. Thank you so much, and envision a whole class thanking you. And we'll end this presentation. So let me see.